2256 by John Eiger. The tape advances for a few moments until, finally, a woman fills the frame. Mid-30s, unkempt hair, but still pretty, she's been crying. When she speaks, her voice is something very close to a croak. "My name is Jane Woods, and I'm a very ordinary person," she says into the camera. She pauses, either to collect her thoughts or collect her nerves. "I wish that I'd never watched that video cassette, or that, having done so, I had died. I found it in 1996, on the day they buried my mamaw. It was that Saturday before Christmas." The light from a window outside the frame becomes bright, and its glare activates the autofocus. Her face blurs, then comes into focus for a moment, and then blurs again. "In those days, back home, I had an unsavory reputation. That's a nice way to put it, right? I suppose I'd made some poor decisions in high school, maybe even up through my 20s. If you'd ever known my mother, you'd understand why. I'm not making excuses. I'm just explaining. Mamaw Ellen raised me because my mom couldn't raise a daughter from the Marshall County Jail or while she was blowing truckers for pills at the Texaco in Abingdon. Everybody in town thought I was a slut, so I didn't want the preacher to drive me to Jackson's apartment after the funeral. Jackson Trent was my boyfriend at the time, and that's where I found it, the video cassette, at Jackson's apartment in a shoebox up on a beam." She clears her throat and pushes a strand of hair flecked with new grays behind her ears. It's a nervous gesture. She feels stripped naked by the camera, whose gaze seems to obsess over the shape of her lips, their fullness and lack of color. "At first I thought Jackson might have put it up there for me to find, some kind of weird joke, but when I watched the stuff recorded there, I knew that was impossible." Her head dips slightly out of frame as she picks up a video cassette. She holds it up so the camera can get a close look. VHS format and a battered yellow slipcase. The slipcase bears a red Kodak logo and other brand-specific markings, as well as stray marks that might have been made by a child playing with a marker. Some of these resemble rudimentary letters or simple faces, but are too crude to make out. The video cassette itself is made of pale gray plastic instead of the standard black, and is clearly not a Kodak. In fact, there are no markings on the tape to identify the manufacturer, or even a self-adhesive label to identify its contents. "I don't like to keep it near me," Jane says in a small voice. "Can't sleep nights if I do. There's a bank in another town where I hide it in a little safe deposit box." She places the tape out of frame. "I'll lock it up again when we're done." What no one knows, or cares to remember, is that there were 3 Gorgons. Each one possessed a visage hideous enough to turn a man to stone with her gaze. Their names, depending on who one asks, were Medusa, Megara, and Stheno, but their true names, for they live within the human soul, are despair, longing, and heartache. "It was wet and cold that day, and I'd never felt so numb," Jane says, looking at something behind the camera. Her eyes seem haunted. "And I wondered if Mima felt that way just before the end. And when I realized it had to have been worse, these waves of tears and shuddering just washed over me again. In fact, it had been so much worse that the doctors euthanized Jane's Mima by inserting a needle into her eye, and that was just to ensure they wouldn't bury her alive. And even then, they couldn't be sure. They used special equipment to verify that her heart and brain activity had stopped before declaring her dead. But how could anyone really tell under all that stone? And anyway, we know that she stayed awake long enough after the stone made it impossible for her to breathe. The 11 o'clock news, WCYB was the only news anyone in town ever watched, appeared that night with a bluster of upbeat yet urgent intro music. A news anchor teased a story about a Marshall County woman's death being linked to a local legend. For such a rural area where a bed-bug infestation at a public library passed for hard news, this had to be the story of a lifetime, if not a dozen lifetimes. Footage shot at Meemaw Ellen's home played throughout the news segment. Camera pans across a daybed in the home of Ellen B. Woods. 7 handmade sock monkeys line the bed in 2 neat rows. They stare at the lens with unseeing button eyes. One of them is called Mojo. Jane had clutched Mojo throughout her pitiable childhood. Here he sits, still beloved but now forgotten, replaced long ago by a succession of Jane's self-absorbed lovers. Mojo would never again comfort a sad or frightened child in the small hours of the night. He now exists only on a small length of analog magnetic videotape. A freak electrical fire will destroy the WCYB video archives in 11 years. When this videotape burns, it will be as though Mojo never existed. WCYB reported as many details of the incident as anyone could. A game warden had found Jane's grandmother, Ellen B. Woods of Golgotha, Virginia, wandering through a row of pines in a mountain road. Everyone in Marshall County knew it as the Government Road. Shortly after midnight on Thursday, when he found her, the game warden said that her arms were completely petrified. When she arrived at Johnston Memorial Hospital, 75% of her body had turned to stone. The outbreak of stone began in the palm of the victim's hand, radiating out to the fingers and up the arm. Skin tissue adjacent to the stone would become red and inflamed before blistering, then becoming rigid and finally turning to stone, oddly veined limestone in Mamaw Ellen's case. During the blister stage, deep tissue beneath the affected area, including fat cells, muscle, blood, lymph, etc., would begin to petrify, followed by bone and cartilage. Ellen B. Woods of Golgotha, Virginia, placed a phone call to her granddaughter, Jane, from the hospital. 3/4 of an hour later, her entire body, except for the soft tissue of her eyes, had turned to stone. "I didn't get to tell my mamaw that I loved her before she died," Jane reflects. "But I guess that's what everybody says when they lose someone unexpectedly. It happened so fast I didn't have time to grieve." The news reports all failed to mention that the phone call placed by Ellen B. Woods of Golgotha, Virginia, didn't actually reach her granddaughter. Instead, she said goodbye to Jane's answering machine. Jane had never listened to the message. "I want to hear her voice again," Jane explains, "but I'm too chicken shit." And so, Mamaw Ellen becomes the 3rd officially documented victim of a real-life Gorgon hidden in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Of course, it isn't really a Gorgon, even as its supplicants ache in despair before their unblinking and madly indifferent god. It once fancied itself to be the pieces of some living thing, but that was very long ago. In 1942, a milkman named Frank Polanski was found by a coon hunter only a dozen or so yards from where Mamaw Ellen was found. According to local legend, the hunting dog that had sniffed out the petrified remains never hunted again and could never again bear to be outdoors after dark. The Marshall County Medical Examiner, with the help of a geology expert from Emory and Henry College, conducted an autopsy to verify that the cadaver was a petrified human being possessing a skeleton, internal organs, and tissue structures of stone, rather than simply a hyper-realistic sculpture. Another strange layer to the case was that Polanski had lived his entire life in and around Baltimore, with no known professional or personal ties to southwestern Virginia or northeast Tennessee. No one, not even Polanski's widow, had ever been able to explain why he was found in an obscure corner of rural Virginia, dressed in his white uniform. On December 5, 1845, a preacher named James Archer Lewis was awakened in the middle of the night by a loud rapping beneath the bedroom window of Golgotha's Methodist parsonage. The building still stands at the end of Balua Avenue, but has since been converted to an antiques shop. Lewis investigated the noise and found a woman in her 40s, writhing like a string puppet manipulated by some madly twitching invisible hand. She spoke to the evangelist long enough to tell a disjointed tale of a hag in the woods, of glowing eyes, the color and hue of sadness, of the sensation of spiders possessed by many tentacles and probing feelers, spinning webs of limestone in her gut before she fell to the ground in a state of utter petrification. Lewis read a service for the unidentified woman and buried her in a cemetery plot behind his church. In the late 1960s, a team of paranormal investigators were granted permission to dig up the grave in an attempt to ascertain the victim's identity. They found petrified remains in the exact state described by Lewis and a number of his parishioners. When attempts at identification failed, the remains were buried once more, this time in a newer cemetery a few miles outside town. 3 days before Halloween in 1978, this second grave was dug up and the remains were stolen. They were never found. The universe exists only in the present. Thus, the fabric of reality has already evaporated before the human mind can process it. Jackson Trent, everybody called him Jiffy Jack, Jane says, but nobody really knew why, ran Mountain Empire Video and Knife on Main Street. Half the store was devoted to video rentals, while the other half was well stocked with outdoor sporting goods and knives. The old men whispered rumors that Jackson conducted a number of questionable activities in his store. Jane dismisses these claims. You know how rumors are in a small town. In August 2000, Jackson Trent was arrested on 2 counts of distributing pornographic material to a minor and 5 counts of selling a firearm with an expired permit. A separate investigation found that a majority of his rental videos had been pirated. I'd been living with Jackson for several months. He had an apartment on the 2nd floor there, and it was always easier to go through the store than to use the back entrance. I remember a skiff of snow had fallen the night before the funeral, and that the wooden Indian outside the storefront was covered in slush. Jane almost allows herself a smile. It's funny what you remember. Her lower lip blossoms pink for 9 seconds, then goes pale once more. I didn't like living there much. You remember the farmhouse in Night of the Living Dead, or the cabin in the Evil Dead movies? The store was kind of like that. All shadows and taxidermy, everything dusty. Daylight would filter through the store's filmy windows and fall onto knife display cases and shelves of new release videos. As one ventured deeper inside, the movies became older and more obscure, the stuffed game more fearsome, with faces frozen in exaggerated rage. The horror and exploitation tapes lined the walls in the darkest corner of the building. They stood on narrow, unfinished wooden shelves guarded by a stuffed brown bear clutching a rainbow trout. The apartment above the store wasn't much homier. Jane sighs, a little uncomfortable with these memories. The camera is a microscope, and she is an insect bound in amber. I guess Jackson was another one of my bad decisions in life. At this point, Jane discusses the tape she found in the shoebox up on a beam in Jackson's apartment. She becomes increasingly agitated as she describes its contents and how viewing it has changed her life. Her sentences are little more than fragments, sometimes contradictory to previous statements. Those watching her interview will invariably become unsettled. Some experience nausea. Portrait of an unhinged woman. Among her more coherent and consistent statements, one can glean a few pieces of information. Apart from barely glimpsed abstract forms and unintelligible speech, probably attributable to old content that had been recorded over, the beginning of the tape is blank. Nearly 23 minutes elapse before any noteworthy content appears. Moments from Jane's life, past, future, real, imagined, play out in brief flashes, only seconds in duration. Awful moments. Moments captured by unseen cameras with impossible placement. Moments that have never been and should never be. Jane lists the scenes she remembers. She only viewed the tape once, but her recollections are crisp and urgent. She ticks off each one with a trembling finger. Her speech slurs and increases in volume, as though she's delirious from fever or excessive drug use. Among the awful moments are these. A lonely Christmas morning with a 5-year-old Jane sitting quietly while her mother leads a strange man to bed. His fingernails are long and dirty, and his flannel work shirt is stained with sweat and kerosene. Cut to her mother on her deathbed. A brief fight against HIV and a long acquaintance with crystal meth have rendered her a living corpse. Jane lowers her face to her mother's blistered lips. "Jane, please don't go," she mumbles. "I need help shitting in the bedpan." And these were her dying words. Fade to prom night and Jane's date, Russell Boggess, actually a third cousin, drunk on blackberry shine and sawing open her panties with a buck knife. He jams his fat, calloused fingers inside her, and she sobs, looking up to the ceiling as if searching for assistance from some indifferent savior. Her desperate sobs continue like a demented musical score as the tape cuts to a cartoon sock monkey with hyper-realistic eyes. They looked wet and veiny, like they'd been magnified by some tool at the eye doctor's office. Recited the exact date of Mamaw Ellen's death, and another date, February 25th, 2006. "You've come to a horrible end," the sock monkey says. Its voice is like a frightened child whispering in the dark. There are other scenes, but Jane either cannot remember them or cannot describe them. She mentions something about a claymation version of herself vomiting and committing acts of self-mutilation. The final scene is the longest on the tape. A woman in her mid-30s fills the screen. She's pretty but distraught, and she fills the camera and makes a long, tearful confession. She's telling some unseen interviewer about all the heartache she's endured and some of the nameless dread that's invaded her life. However, the audio of her confession grows increasingly distorted and muffled, only to be replaced by the same low sobbing as before. Sobs turn into screams, and screams lengthen and become frenzied, the screamer's voice rasping. Finally, the noise is more like the terrified and desperate barks of a small mammal as it is being flayed. Cut to static and blank tape. Death is the only valid reality. All living things are fundamentally unreal. Right now, I work on the overnight stocking crew at the food country in Abingdon. She flashes a brittle smile. I have a hard time sleeping nights, and I figure, why not take advantage of all that time that I'd be home by myself, in the dark. Since that day, since the video, I've had a hard time holding down jobs. This is the first one I've been at for more than 8 months or so. She lists the dozen or more jobs she's lost since viewing the videotape and complains of health issues that she believes the tape has caused. These include back problems, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and an anxiety disorder resulting in vivid nightmares. Sometimes when I wake up, the fear and the terror are all that I can remember of the dream, and sometimes the dreams are as real as anything I've ever touched. They're as real as you. They're as real as the blinking light on that camera. Her most frequent recurring nightmare is set in Jackson's video store. Sometimes the snow is falling, sometimes heavy sheets of rain, but it is always dark, and Jane's dream self must always seek refuge in the store. The only light in the store is from the flicker of a television behind the counter. Sometimes the TV is the actual set in the store, and other times it's one of those ancient, large as a dresser, walnut console TVs from Mamaw Ellen's living room. Standing opposite the television is Mamaw Ellen in her limestone form. Her eyes are unusually wide and moist. Her cheeks glisten with teardrops. Her pose reminds Jane of a wooden Indian or a stuffed bear. In fact, some versions of the dream depict the petrified grandmother clutching an inanimate catfish or a bundle of wooden cigars. The video playing on the Dream World's TV is similar, but not identical to the one Jane found in a shoebox up on a beam, though it's always a pageant of atrocity, pain, and humiliation. Grotesque sock monkeys often make an appearance. Sometimes the video is not at all visible to the dreamer, but its effects are always felt. On a few occasions, Jane has attempted to fight the dream, to stop the video, to end her grandmother's captive torment. She always fails in these attempts. "That's what I dream at least once a week, usually more," she says with a shrug. "Take it for what it is." The nothingness is hungry. It is now Christmas Eve, or rather Christmas morning, Jane says. She is reading from a battered composition notebook. No one would consider Jane to be a talented woman, but she has a knack for doodling. Pages from the notebook are littered with pencil sketches of the same figure, a frail woman in white. Instead of a head, a late 1970s model Zenith television is perched atop her spindly neck. Her skeletal arms are a ruin of infected track marks. I haven't eaten a meal since watching that tape. She clears her throat. My mama, the only person who's ever loved me, is a slab of rock buried in a cheap cemetery plot. I believe that the hag in the woods killed her, and then somehow authored a weird videotape to mock and torment me. That is what I believe. That is my only belief. Wet eyes stare back at me through every shadow, and on the backs of my own eyelids. There's nothing left for me here except this awful thing that has invaded my life. The 7 o'clock news is over, and the static from the TV is stuck in my throat. Jane stops to dab her eyes and nose with a moist, disintegrating wad of tissue. It's a full minute before she's ready to continue reading. I'm writing down what's happened in this notebook so that, if anybody cares, they might be able to answer the questions that I can't. And as I write this, I'm parked somewhere along the government road. I'm looking for the hag that killed my mama. I hope to find out who she is and who I am. After a long pause, she chokes down a violent, terrified sob. It's so dark, but I think we will meet before dawn. I'm fighting my sleep now, but she's awfully close. Whenever I close my eyes, I can hear the same awful sounds from the videotape just outside my car. The tape stops automatically, rewinds a trifle faster than it would in most players. Then small internal rotors whine almost imperceptibly just before the tape begins playing again. It advances 22 minutes and 56 seconds of mostly blank tape. A woman fills the frame. Mid-30s, unkempt hair, but still pretty, she's been crying. When she speaks, she sounds as though she is struggling with a lump in her throat. My name is Jane Woods, and I'm a very ordinary person. John Eiger lives on a steady diet of old VHS tapes, crumpled monster magazines, and Mountain Dew. He is an emerging writer whose stories, like the mating rituals of the North American Sasquatch, remain largely unknown. Follow him on Facebook at facebook.com/eiger.fiction. The music in this episode is by Sealand. You can find more of their work, including their album Dark Days, at sealand.bandcamp.com.